It's a bright and sunny day in Seoul. The sun's, though, all just gone behind the clouds a few minutes ago. It's about 4:20 p.m. local time, and there's no evidence here on the streets of this city to suggest that, there's any tension about the sharpened rhetoric that we've seen come in from North Korea and the United States of America. In fact, I've been out on the streets talking to people, and many of them say they've heard these threats from Pyongyang so many times that they're actually quite used to it. One man actually said to me that he thinks North Korea is bluffing. But I have to say that some people did tell me that they find it scary. They do find it worrying, especially because it doesn't seem to be ending. Every day you hear a comment coming from North Korea, then you hear another one coming from President Trump or America. So where is this all heading, and what should we expect in the days and weeks ahead? Well, I'm Yogita Limaye, and I'm going to be putting those questions and any of the questions that you have. We're on our Facebook page, and I encourage you to leave your questions and comments, in the comment section. And I'm going to take those questions and mine to John Delury, Associate Professor of Eastern Studies at the Yongsei University. Thanks very much for being here. I'm going to start with my first question before people actually start writing into us. I spoke to you 4 days ago.
Yeah.
We were talking about exactly the same thing. You'd heard a very sharp comment coming from North Korea. We'd had the sanctions that were passed against North Korea by the UN, and pretty tough language from America. What's changed? In the past 4 days, to what extent have things gotten worse?
Well, I would say apart from the rhetoric, which has really intensified to a new level, we have a particular problem right now. Maybe a little too strong to say there's kind of a time bomb that's ticking, but there's a problem with a specific North Korean plan that they've announced, and they put out at least 3 statements over the last couple of days announcing that they have a plan to fire 4 missiles. They are not attacking Guam, but they are planning to fire around Guam. And, some people are paying attention to that. I think maybe not everyone is fully aware of the sort of problem we could have on our hands in the next 2 weeks. So I think that's one thing that hadn't happened yet when we talked, and that's one of the things that I've been concerned about and trying to think through.
And in your time, studying this region and this particular conflict, have you seen that kind of, do you remember, have you seen this kind of a very specific threat come from North Korea before?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are, it's tough. It's like the ultimate boy who cried wolf problem when you pay attention to and listen to North Korean, to the state media. I mean, it's safe to, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, you can kind of say there's a threat every day. I mean, there's something in the language that is threatening. And then you have plenty of specific threats. But the situation right now is quite tense. The language coming out of the White House, we haven't heard this. Certainly for the whole Obama administration, there was nothing remotely like this. There was a very strong action, as you just said, the Security Council. And the other factor is we're moving soon into what's called the joint military exercises, which is always a period of intensified conflict. So there's some specificity to this Guam thing. Actually, one of the threats that you could call it that kind of is on my mind that again makes me worried is back in 2010, which was the last time there was real sort of conflict. The North Koreans used their hotline, which is now defunct, between the North and South, and they called up and they told the South Koreans, they said, don't do these artillery exercises you're going to do. And the South Koreans ignored it, and lo and behold, a few hours later, the North Koreans started firing artillery at that island off of the coast, and there was an artillery battle. So that's an example. There are differences, but that was a very specific threat. It was kind of ignored. And then there was a real conflict. So.
Well, we have got some questions coming in now, and I think this is a question that a lot of people around the world are asking. Rebecca says, do you think it's the start of a Cold War between them, or will it actually end in a war?
That's an interesting question. I mean, people say about the Korean Peninsula that the Cold War never ended here. So it's sort of interesting, Rebecca would say, is the Cold War starting? Because I guess that would be my answer, is that it never really ended. And in terms of so the question is, could the Cold War turn hot again? I mean, actually, the first hot conflict of the Cold War was, of course, the Korean War in 1950 to 1953. Still the odds are low because by any rational cost-benefit analysis for the principles, for the North Koreans and for the Americans, I would say especially for the Americans, it is insane to start a war, to get involved in a war. It makes absolutely no sense. But the rhetoric right now is kind of off the charts. Again, especially we're not used to the United States and the president of the United States using this kind of rhetoric. And so that's why Rebecca's asking the question, and that's why people are worried about it. All I can say is the next 2 weeks could continue to be bumpy. And even if we get through that without a conflict, without diplomacy, and without really making an effort to kind of switch gears here, this just goes on and on and on. The North Koreans will do this every day. This is how they were playing their game, and they'll keep doing this, and they'll kind of keep us on edge.
Well, we have another question coming in from Frank Young, who says, how are South Koreans preparing for the possibility of war? I know, you just talked about the fact that, that you don't think it's very likely that we're actually going to see anything. But do you think there's any preparation? We've heard from the government, several times over the past few days. What do you think South Korea is doing in response to this rhetoric?
Yeah. Well, I would say no to Frank. There's no active preparation going on. Nothing is really changing that I'm observing in my own daily life here. Our university is not, doing drills where we all run to the bunker. If that's his question about kind of our people getting ready, absolutely not. And even in general, South Koreans are weirdly kind of paying less attention to this than the rest of the world. I mean, it's starting to sink in now, and people are a little bit more paying attention and concerned. But you would think South Koreans would be the most concerned people. When this was first starting to hit, no one was paying attention. A couple days ago, zero. So that's a very complex, why that's the case is a really complex thing. And you shouldn't say, oh, well, then it should be fine because the South Koreans would know. Part of the problem here is South Koreans are so used to this. They're just inured. They've been doing this for decades. So it's really hard to get them worried. But that doesn't mean that they know best, because the danger right now is between the United States and North Korea. The South Korean government does not want a conflict. The South Korean government, frankly, if it were just the South Korean government making calls right now, I think they'd be doing things to take down the temperature.
Yeah. This is the question that I had, that do you think what the president in America is saying is sort of putting this country in a difficult position? Yeah,
I do. I think that, the South Korean government would not want to undermine the close relationship, the alliance with the United States, when there is so much attention and on the issue. You don't want to kind of signal a gap between Seoul and Washington, but it is very clear in terms of what South Korean people want. There is zero interest in moving this toward military conflict. And people do understand the gravity of that. And this is one of the first places that gets hit, although it's not just South Korea that would suffer. There are direct ways in which the United States would suffer, even if it's economic. American citizens like me, you go down the list. So I think that it is problematic, from a South Korean perspective, from the government, which is paying more attention to this. How do you kind of signal, whoa, like we need to move away from the edge of the cliff here without, looking weak, without looking like a bad ally to the United States? That's a conundrum.
So this is Ross's question. Do you think that North Korea's long history of being in the middle of great power politics in the East will always shape how North Korea's elite reacts to crises like these?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a good point embedded in that question. I think it goes to something important happening right now, which is sort of the way that North Korea, the government, the broader sort of elite, they do thrive on this situation. The way I explain it is they're very comfortable with this. They're comfortable being threatened. by the world. They're comfortable being on the brink, and having a reason to have mass rallies. I mean, there are days now of mass rallies in Pyongyang, unifying all the people or showing unity to confront the United States, to confront imperialism. And it's also, in a way, it's kind of a perfect North Korean moment because it's North Korea against the whole world, right? So the UN Security Council resolution, 15-0, the Trump administration has been trumpeting how great that was. 15-0, we won. Well, for North Korea, that's also a win because it's us against everyone. And we don't have Russia, we don't need Russia. We don't have China, we don't have China. We're standing up to the whole world. So it fits their part of their national identity, especially the elite. It fits their legitimacy, their narrative, all these things we talk about. So that's why I say they thrive on this. They can keep doing this to kingdom come.
Well, we're answering as many or taking as many questions as we can to Professor Delury. No, not the answers are really interesting. So I encourage you to leave more questions and comments, on this Facebook Live. We do have another question actually coming in. If North Korea and the US cannot handle a constructive dialogue, what would be the best form of de-escalation? Is there anything that international society can do?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it is a thing. This is a situation where third parties, other countries, the UN, you name it, actually outside of China and Russia, should be thinking about what could we do. How could we maybe give both sides a face-saving way to de-escalate the situation, especially if, as I worry, over the next week or two, this is going to get kind of worse and worse as the Guam plan starts to look like it might actually happen. So there are things that both sides could do. There are some immediate steps. They'd be a little bit hard for both sides. It involves kind of losing face. It involves looking a little weak for both the North Koreans and the Americans, for both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. One of those things that the North Koreans have kind of set this up, admittedly, but the reason that they're targeting Guam is they vehemently object to the United States flying strategic bombers, right, up to the Korean Peninsula. And, I mean, frankly, understandably, the North Koreans find that threatening and provocative, and they don't like it. So they've been objecting to that. And essentially this Guam thing is a way of very, very provocatively saying you got to stop that. And if you don't, we're going to do this. So, one thing that both sides could do, and maybe you need a third party to kind of offer this up, is a short-term agreement, which at least kind of gets us through the next few weeks, where the North Koreans say, forget the Guam thing. The Americans say, okay, we're not sending those bombers up to your neighborhood, say, for the August exercises. There are some Americans who, if they're on Facebook Live now, are going to be jumping all over that. We can't do that. We can't let down our deterrent, etc. And we could have a debate about that. I would say, and it's a legitimate disagreement, but I would say if the United States does not fly those strategic bombers up to South Korea, the world's not going to end. North Korea is not going to invade the South. When you're really strong, you can afford to look weak for a week or two, if that's what it takes to de-escalate. So that's one example. There are other ways. There are things that both sides could do that are nice to each other and non-threatening to each other, rather than just keep playing chicken and getting kind of closer and closer and right up in each other's face.
Well, thanks so much for answering all of those questions for us. I think that makes a lot of things clearer for people around the world who've been watching, headlines, sometimes getting nervous as well. Thank you for your questions. I hope we've been able to answer as many as we can. Bye-bye.